nerd soul.
But it all depends on where you are in your creative process, how you're going to start your world building. One of the things that I think about a lot when I'm a big history buff, so a lot of times my worlds are based on other histories, other cultures that existed. But when you start to study cultures and you start to look at them, you see one thing that's really important that a lot of us don't take into consideration, and that's geography. Geography has a big factor in your world building and how your people live. I'll give you some perfect examples. I consider them perfect examples. If you have done study of any kind of different culture, you usually find out that the people who are the most difficult to defeat are the people who live in the mountains. When you look at in Vietnam, a group of people that lived in Vietnam, they were difficult to defeat living in the mountains. When you look at, actually the original people that we know as the assassins, when they developed their culture, their stronghold was in the mountains. And there's something about the mountains that make people unique. First of all, it's difficult to get through. And it also develops a culture that is very insular, even among the people in the mountains themselves. If you're familiar with the mountains of Appalachia, and people talk about being from different hollows, different part of the mountains and stuff like that, and they all are separated by that. And so those are things that affect people. Another thing about mountains, another physical feature, I used to always wonder why the northwest of America was so rainy. And then I found out the reason was because when weather fronts come from the west, they get literally stopped by the mountains. So that's where the rain happens. And in almost every situation on the other side of those mountains is desert. I didn't realize there was a desert in Oregon until I visited Oregon. And they said, well, hey, we got the high desert. I'm like, what are you talking about high desert? They said, yeah, you go through the mountains, and the other part on the side of the mountains is desert. And so when you're looking at building a world, when you develop physical features like that, what I do is also look at how those physical features are going to affect the weather, and in turn, how is it going to affect the people that live in those conditions? What will they develop from that kind of thing? So that's one important thing of it. And then we talk about cultures itself. We talk about what cultures, the culture that you work with, what are the things that are going to be important to them. Most of the time, as Americans, we tend to base a lot of our stuff on Western culture. When we're looking for a foundation of world building, we're looking at European culture. We're looking at, I could literally write a story about knights and kings and queens in my sleep because I've heard about it so much. You know it, you're so familiar with it. You know the politics of it. You know all of it. It's an easy thing to go to. It's an easy default. And then we want to get even more specific than that. Some people just focus on can you think of the name? The Lord of the Rings guys. They just focus on his stuff, elves and orcs and different things like that. But when you're talking about other cultures and developing on other cultures, which I do because I do Afrocentric world building, I'm focusing my worlds on African-based cultures. So I have to do a lot more research because although I'm an African American, I was not born in Africa. I don't have that kind of contact with cultures. But I feel like because I am African American, I have a certain sensitivity to those cultures where I'm not going in with some preconceived notions that I learned from some thing that a British guy wrote in the 19th centuries who was basically just trying to prove why the British was so superior to everybody else, that kind of thing. So I'm not blinded by that kind of stuff. I'll give you a perfect example of that. One of the first books I read for research and history was a book about the Zulu. British love to talk about the Zulu because the Zulu beat them in one big one army in South Africa and stuff, so they love to talk about how great the Zulu are. But there was a theory, and I don't know if you guys have heard this before, it's called the Hamite theory. And the Hamite theory basically said that it was supposed to be explaining why the Bantu people in East Africa were so successful. And the Hamite theory basically said it's partially based on the Bible. If you guys are familiar with the Bible, the Hamites, the 13th tribe of Hamites. It's based on the fact that there was a group of people called the Hamites that migrated from the Middle East into East Africa. And as they migrated further and further down, they started to meld with the African cultures in East Africa. So basically, based on the Hamitic theory, every culture that was of any significance in East Africa was related to the Hamites. Basically saying that these were not original ideals, these were people that were influenced by somebody from the outside. One of the big examples of that is the city of Great Zimbabwe. I don't know if you're familiar. It's a stone city in Zimbabwe itself called Great Zimbabwe, and it's basically a stone city. You know. And when Europeans first came across it, their first thing was, aha, we just found the home of Prester John. And Prester John was supposed to be this great Christian guy that disappeared one day, and when they found Great Zimbabwe, they said, it's got to be Prester John because these people don't know how to build anything from stone. But the reality of that is that the architecture is very Afrocentric. It's not related to anything in Europe. And one thing that a lot of people don't tell you about is that in South Africa, there were a lot of stone buildings built from people in that area, that culture. But nobody tells you about that. So those are kind of some of the things that you have to look out for when you're doing Afrocentric world building. Looking at the cultures themselves, understanding what they do, understanding their what they do from their particular standpoint. And I may talk about some stuff that might be a little bit uncomfortable for some folks, but I'm trying to see that this is what you have to do when you're really looking at something being Afrocentric. I'll give you another example. The Kingdom of Dahomey. A lot of us learned about that watching the movie of The Woman King. Which basically was able to be what it was because of Black Panther and the Dora Milaje. And people said, oh, the Dora Milaje are based on the minnow from Dahomey. And so somebody said, okay, let's make a movie about Dahomey. And so that's where The Woman King came to be. One of the things that people did not like about the Dahomey Kingdom during the 1890s, people had like a love-hate relation with them. One reason was that it was the 19th century, and there was this African kingdom that was fighting to defend itself. But on the other end, there was an African kingdom that was involved in slavery. And one of the aspects of their culture was there was sacrifice. And when you look at it on the surface, it's like, oh, this is terrible, which it is. But in their culture, ancestors were very active in the day-to-day lives. Your ancestors could influence what happens today. And one of the best ways to get the ancestors to influence you in the right way was to send the ancestors gifts. And basically, when you sacrificed a person, you were sending a servant to the ancestors. And you would think that the ancestors would be favorable of you, and then they would do what you need them to do. Now, of course, we look at it today, and I look at it and I'm like, oh, this ain't a good thing to do. But again, this is their culture. This is the way they look at their culture. And that's the way, when you're writing that, you have to be sensitive to that. My first book, I'm going to use examples throughout here. My first book, Menchi, I wrote this after I had done a lot of research on African culture, and I wanted to express that in a way where people would, I wanted to express my knowledge in African culture and celebrate it by writing this book. And each culture in this book is based on a specific African culture. The Sesu are based on the Zulu, the Mwenga are based on the Ashanti. You know, I just did different cultures and I based it on these people, and then I, interacted them together. As a fiction writer, I took some license. Everything's not exactly the way it is in those cultures. Some of the stuff I would not be able to learn, because having certain knowledge means becoming initiated into certain groups, and initiation is very sensitive. You just don't do that with anybody. You have to have somebody that has a real connection that's really trying to do this. One of my writing cohorts is a Yoruba priest of Ifa. And I read a book called The Oracle of Ifa, which is supposed to be like a book that has a lot of their sayings and stories and stuff like that. And I read this book, and I told him, this before I met him, I said, yeah, man, I read The Oracle of Ifa. And he looked at me and said, you didn't understand a word in there. And I'm like, yes, I did, man, because the story told this and it said that. He said, no, he said, because the stories are open to interpretation. They're not supposed to be read literally. Not only are they supposed to be interpreted for a particular person, also it's based on the divination. So I read a story and I do a divination, and then that tells me what that story really means for that person. So learning that itself told me that I had to go back. Some of the stuff I had written based on this culture, I had to go back and look at it from a different aspect, because I really didn't understand it. And that kind of takes me into what we talk about writing world building from an aspect of faith. as a Christian person, I found it difficult sometimes when I was writing about different cultures because of how I was raised and what I was raised to believe. But at the same time, as a person of faith, it gave me some connection because I would say, okay, I've got to write about this culture, and I've got to write about it in a certain way. And I have to write about this in a way where this person this is this person's way of belief. And I know how I feel about my own faith, so I had to take that same energy into writing that culture that way. Either if it's African culture, if it's Celtic culture, if whatever culture you're basing it on, to me you have to kind of detach yourself from what you normally believe. And if you really want to get a good feel for those characters, you have to really put yourself into the character's place, into that this is what they believe, and this is how they react, and this is how they act in situations. And to me, when you do that, that's what makes your story have depth. Because now I'm not seeing your message behind the story, I'm seeing the character's message. I'm seeing what the character is trying to tell me. Another thing is if you're looking at laws, what are the laws that are going to be in your world? What's going to be allowed? What's not going to be allowed? There was a presentation I was in one time where we were talking about world building, and a person said the reason why there's every law that you ever seen before is because somebody did that. It wasn't, you don't make laws in anticipation of something. You make laws because somebody did that, and you don't want anybody to do it again. So you come up with a law to keep that from happening again. And so when you develop your world, when you have your culture, you want to look at what are going to be the rules of your culture. And that's really important too, because you don't want a culture where anything goes. Everybody can do anything. There's no tension. There's no reason to tell a story. There has to be opportunities, but there also has to be restrictions. And those are the things that create a story, or create the energy for a story. You have to be, and when you're writing about those laws, if you're doing historical fiction, there are always exceptions to any situation, but you also have to take in mind that things don't happen the way they do now. People don't get what they want. People are the same. I think people don't change. People are the same throughout history. We all get angry. We all get happy. We're all ambitious. We all get ambitious. Some of us are greedy. We just have all those things going on. Those haven't changed as long as humans have been on the planet. The thing that has changed is how we go about dealing with those emotions and how we go about doing the things we need to do. And when you write a story and you created that world, if it's a historical based world, then you have to write about that in the context of that culture and in the context of that time. And sometimes that time period may not be the way that you want it to be. And you say, okay, I'm going to write about a character that defied all that. This character didn't go along with those rules. And you can do that because we have perfect examples of it throughout history. But when you do that, you also have to understand the consequences of that person making that decision in that time period. Again, you have to detach. I think that's the biggest thing about the world, is that you have to detach yourself from what you know now and immerse yourself into the world that you created. Now, sometimes we'll create a world that we want to do this kind of stuff. We want to bring that modern sensibility into that world. To me, depending on how you handle it, if you create a world with a certain set of rules and stuff like that, and then people do certain things and it doesn't jive with the world that you created, then it seems less real to me. And I kind of get out of the story. Unless you did something earlier to plant that seed to say that this is possible. Or the way that the person does it is a logical step. And I think that's the biggest thing about it, is being logical about stuff. Then there's like I call taboos, things that you can and you can't do. Every culture has different things that you can and you can't do. And it has nothing to do with a universal thing. It's just something that some things you can do, some things you can't do. And you have to establish those for your book. Again, these restrictions that you're establishing, again, to me brings more realism to the world that you're building. And it gives people a better sense of what they're dealing with. And it gives you a better story. In this book, this is an example of taking an old culture and putting it into an advanced situation. This is a book that a collection of stories that we did based on a universe that we created. We call it the Dark Universe. And it's basically an Afrocentric galactic empire. And in one of the stories in here that I wrote called Customs, this is a culture that's kind of based on Dahomey fawn culture. In the kingdom of Dahomey, once a year, or even more often than that, everyone had to come back to the capital of Omen. And the king basically had to display to everybody that he was worthy to be king. And anybody that served the king had to bring gifts and say, okay, we love you, here are our gifts, and that's basically where the king got his wealth from. In this particular book, you had a galactic empire. You had different kingdoms, different sections, and every 10 years they all had to come back to the home planet for customs. And when they came back, they had to bring a certain amount of wealth with them, goods and everything like that. So for that entire 10 years, these planets are basically trying to build their gift for customs. And everybody had a certain amount of gift that they had to give. And for some planets it was easy because they had the wealth, they had the farming, they had the minerals that could do it. But for other ones it was a strain. And by doing this every 10 years, it was basically every 10 years their planets were sinking lower and lower for their local people because it was a strain on them to do this. It was taken away from their economy and their culture. And in the story that we wrote, the result is that this particular planet ends up becoming one of the main planets for rebellion because the customs that were put on them were becoming unbearable. And the people who lived on this planet had been on the planet so long that they started not to associate themselves with the kingdom itself, but with their people. And they were no longer going to do anything that would make their people suffer. And that's one of those situations where I say the customs and the culture creates this tension and creates this situation where there's a story to tell. Because everything has a consequence. When we're looking at type of world building too, I look at some of the different things that I take into consideration. Is like if it's historical world building, then basically I've got a world to base it on. I write a lot of stuff from the 19th century, different centuries. This book here, Changa Safari, was based on 15th century East African culture. I did it for a reason because I wanted to talk about that. So I had to do research, and not just in East African culture, but I had to do research in Chinese culture, in Japanese culture, in Indian culture, because East Africa had contact in all those different parts of the world. So when I had my character travel to these parts of the world, I wanted it to be authentic to those cultures at that time. So I wasn't talking about Vietnam, I was talking about Champa, that's what it was known as at the time. I wasn't talking about India, I was talking about the Mogul city-states in Vijayanagar. I wasn't talking about Ethiopia, I was talking about Assyria. So I had to make sure that when I talked about that, and when I talked about the people and I talked about those cultures, that I was coming from that perspective. Not from now, but from how it was in the 15th century. I wasn't calling Japan, I was calling either Nihon or Japan. So those are the two different things that I had to do. When you talk about, it's a little easier when you're building a world based on contemporary history, contemporary world, because everything's basically the same. We're talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer stuff and different things like that. So basically you're dealing with, it's an easy story to write because you know everything. You know what's happening right now. The only difference now is that there's vampires and there's werewolves or there are shapeshifters or now there may be mermaids, So you got all these different things going on. But again, when you build that world, you have to take into consideration how is it having those things present are going to change the situation you're in. What are the rules for vampires? What are the rules for werewolves? What's happening in that situation? How are they existing among regular people and not being seen? Or if they are being seen, how are they controlling different things like that? So that's where your world building comes in. What kind of society are you going to have? Are your vampires going to have? What kind of society are your mermaids going to have? That kind of thing like that. And how is that going to affect? How do they get away with not being seen and different things like that? So that's a little bit on a contemporary standpoint. And then you have one of my favorite ones, which is alternate history. Alternate history is basically what if. What if this happened instead of that happening? What if the Carthaginians beat the Romans instead of vice versa? What if the Mongols had never stopped in East Europe and ended up taking over the entire European continent. You know, what if the North America and South America was never colonized? You know, and there's actually a whole genre on alternate history, and people fight about it all the time. I wrote a book called From Here to Timbuktu, and this book is based on what if the Haitian Revolution had spread into the southern United States and had been successful? You know, what would have been the results of that? You know, and of course everybody's going to have their own idea, but I had to sit down and think about what would that mean. Well, one thing it would mean, because when the Haitian Revolution took place in the early 19th century, well, that's when it ended, like 1813, something like that. That meant that the Trail of Tears would have never happened, because the Haitians or people who took over wouldn't have been interested in relocating the Cherokees. So they would have been right where they are. And so what would have been the consequence of that? You know. So you're looking at all these different things and you're trying to decide, okay, well, what kind of world are we dealing with? One of the coolest things that happened, this is a side note, when I was in Louisiana, I was in New Orleans a couple of years ago. And part of what I based that story on was that outside of New Orleans, there was a revolt called the Germantown Revolt. And it was basically a slave revolt where some enslaved Africans basically got together and they were marching on New Orleans, but they were stopped. It was like about 100 of them going to New Orleans, they were stopped. And it was kind of buried because people didn't want anybody else to know that this had happened and they didn't want to spread throughout the South. So when I was in New Orleans, a friend of mine told me about this Whitney plantation that was outside of New Orleans. So my wife and I said, let's go visit that. So we go visit it, and the Whitney plantation is unique is because they were telling you about the plantation experience from the enslaved African experience. And when I'm there and they're telling me about this stuff, I said, well, where's the German coast? And they looked at me and said, you're standing on it. So this is German coast. This is where that revolt that you were talking about, this is where it started. And they actually have a monument on that plantation to that particular revolt. And, you know, that blew me away, of course. I'm like, oh, this is the place I'm talking about. You know, me being a history nerd like I am, I'm like, you know, fanboying all over the place, that kind of stuff like that. But those are the things that, you know, when I look at doing, in this particular book, I'm trying to figure out not only how this new country, this new nation would have affected the status of North America, but also how would it have affected the rest of the world. And that's where my stories come from. And then you can just have what I call original world building, where you're not basing it on anything. You're just going to sit down here and you're just going to create this world, and it's going to be your world and stuff like that. Some perfect examples, I remember a book that I read by Clive Barker, where the whole world took place on carpet. And it was fascinating how he built the whole world in a carpet. and then there's a friend of mine named Carol McDonald, who has a world where it's called a constant tower. And basically these people live in towers. And these towers randomly relocate to different parts of their world. And you never know where it's going to stop. You'll be in there one place and you never know when the tower is going to do it. You got some people who are supposed to be able to control the towers, but they really can't control them well. And so when the towers get ready to move, they say, okay, everybody get in the tower, we're getting ready to go. Like that, and then all of a sudden it pops up someplace else. Now they do follow kind of a pattern. So the territories where your towers lands, you consider your territories. But sometimes somebody else's tower shows up. And then you have a conflict between towers. And I thought that was one of the most original pieces of world building I ever seen in my life, because I couldn't link it to anything else I had ever read before. I couldn't discover where she got that from. You know, it's just that she built this world, and it was just fascinating. But even when you build your own worlds like that, again, you have to take it, because we're conditioned to read certain things. So you do have to have these rules and these laws that are in place for your world that you built. And I need to be convinced that these things are real so I can get into your world and experience the way that you want me to experience. And so it takes a lot of details. It takes, some things into consideration. Even when we talk about food, what people eat, what they don't eat. Some people have taboos from certain foods that they're not supposed to eat. Different things like that. So those are all the little details that kind of helps you identify and bring your world into focus. Now I know it may sound like I'm rambling a little bit, and I kind of am, because world building is kind of art, but But you have to, but to me, there are certain things that you need to consider when you're talking about those different worlds. Even when we look at, and I'll give you guys a chance to ask a question in a few minutes. Even when we look at some of the contemporary things that we look at, sometimes the world building is based on culture, but it's also based on experience. When we look at Tolkien, when he wrote Lord of the Rings, it was based on him telling a mythology about a certain group of people, but it also was based on his experiences of fighting in World War I. And when you know that, then you understand why he told these stories the way he told them. Another perfect example is Robert E. Howard. I used to be a big Conan fan back in the day. And I'm reading the Conan books, I'm getting all fired up and stuff. Conan, the Aquilonians, the Sumerians, and all that kind of stuff like that. The Scythians and all this kind of stuff. So one day I'm reading this book about the Celtic culture. And it's talking about Celtic culture throughout Europe. And I'm reading this book about Celtic culture. Hey, these Celtic people, and there's the Sumerians, and the Scythians, and the Aquilonians. And then I come to find out that was because Robert E. Howard was an anthropology major. And he knew about all these different cultures. And basically when he was writing Conan, he was incorporating his knowledge of those cultures into those stories. And one more example is one of my favorite science fiction books ever is Dune. I love Dune. I mean, Dune was the first book that I read that felt real to me when I was reading science fiction. I was like blown away, like, how is this guy making this stuff up? And it feels so real, and the Fremen and all this kind of stuff. The thing that blew me away the most was the Fremen were desert people. And when they met Paul Atreides' father and Stilgar spit, and they thought it was an insult, but then they said, no, for the Fremen, water's precious. And so since he spit, he's giving up his body water for you. So that's basically a compliment. That means he respects you. I'm like, oh my God, this is crazy, like I said that. But then later on, I got older and found out, well, the Fremen were based on Arab culture. I didn't know anything about Arab culture. I didn't know anything about desert cultures. But as I got older and I saw that, I was like, okay, so basically that's where he got that from. And back in the 60s, nobody else probably knew that either. It's like, oh man, he thought about all this stuff himself. But then you look at other books that Frank Herbert wrote, and you find that that's a common theme in his book is to show the relationship between environment and cultures. If you ever get around to it, there's a book that he has called The Sad-Eye Experiment. And it's it's a perfect example of how he uses environment to determine how cultures will react. Certain restrictions, why certain things become important to them. Even going into one in the desert and nomad cultures, when we look at history, desert and nomad cultures tend to be the more warlike cultures. They tend to be the ones that end up being conquering everybody else. And that's because they're basically in an environment of scarcity. And they have to fight for what they want. So they're fighting all the time. And when you start talking about settled, sedate farming cultures, they tend to be more peaceful, they're less violent. Even in parts of Africa, there's a part of Africa, you got northern Africa where the Sahara is. And you have what we call sub-Saharan Africa, which is the forest area of Africa, which has Ghana and different places like that. There's an area in between there called the Sahel. And it's an Arab word that means the shore, and it's a grassland. And you had nomadic people who came in contact with the farming people, and whenever the nomadic people ran out of stuff, they raided farms. So the farmers got this thing and said, okay, you know what? We're going to leave some of our stuff in the field. We're not going to harvest it. We're going to leave it there. So when you come, you get that stuff, and you go back to the desert, and you leave us alone, basically. So they developed that relationship. We're tired of these people attacking us, so let's leave them something to eat. And that way, when they come, they'll see something to eat, they'll go back home and stuff like that. So those are different other examples of how environments affect culture, and how those cultures, end up coming with rules and laws and balances because of that environment. So that's enough of my rambling. I'm going to open it up for questions. Anybody have any questions about world building in general or things that they're doing specifically?
So, when you're world building and you kind of have your idea of the rules and laws of the world in your head, how do you organically introduce that in your story without it being overwhelming to the reader, but still kind of making sense?
So you're trying to say, how do I avoid an info dump?
Yeah.
You know, my thing is that I just tell the story, and I trust the intelligence of the reader. I put the character in those situations and let them basically learn about the world as they read the book. I don't over-explain anything unless I have to. And if I do have it in a situation where I have to explain it, I try to put it in the context of a conversation with somebody who really doesn't know, you know, because otherwise it's redundant. But that's basically what I try to do with it. Sometimes, depending on the situation, you can't avoid some of it. But what I try to do is break it up. You know, when I wrote Changa Safari, I used Swahili words and I did not tell people what they meant. Because my people were Swahili. They didn't know what they meant. They didn't even know what they mean. They knew what they meant, you know. Now, if they came into contact with somebody who didn't speak Swahili, it was another thing. But when they were talking among themselves, I just used the words. And I said, okay, either the reader's going to be able to tell what the words mean out of context, or they're going to go look it up. Because I was actually had one reader that said, you forced us to learn Swahili. She wouldn't tell us anything. So. But I think that's the best way to do it, is just kind of trust the readers and just tell your story. The details will make a difference. The details will give them a context of what the stuff means that you're talking about. You know, if you have a person that, say, for instance, they're not supposed to eat rice, you know, you might have a situation where, you know, you may say, Milton looked at the bowl of rice and knew this was a bad omen, you know, but he wanted it so bad, but he knew if somebody comes, so all of a sudden you explain that this is something that he's not supposed to do, and this is something that's taboo in his culture. You know, you put the person in those situations where, if that's important, because writing is like an iceberg. You know, 90% of the stuff that you develop in your world, your people shouldn't see. But if you develop it properly, people will know it's there, because it will feel deep. It will feel like it started before they got there. That's the thing. When I come to your book, I should feel like I'm coming into the middle of something that's been existing hundreds of years before I even got there. And you're just telling me one piece about that world in that particular situation. And when I leave, it's all right if I don't know everything else about your world. It's just that for that moment and for that time, I was experiencing your world, and it was interesting to me. Questions? Comments? Curses? I don't think I answered everybody's question. Her question.
When you're starting a new book, how do you know where to start? Because sometimes you get all these ideas and it's overwhelming and you don't know what to actually start writing.
In general, we tell people to start as closest to the action as possible. Some people will write a whole chapter before they even get to the story. Unless you're a very good writer and you just have that gift of prose that you can capture me and, you know, make me really appreciate the blooming of the flowers in spring just before the winds become strong and all that kind of stuff like that, I might be with you. But for me, it's like you start as close to the action as possible. I'll give you a perfect example. And I always use this because I wrote this in a writing class and they thought it was crazy and they thought I loved it. So I held this first sentence just for this book. The first sentence of this book is, "This was not the way for a prince to die." And all of a sudden you're like, what the hell? What's going on? And then from that point on, it's like action. And you're following this character and you're following what's going on and stuff like that. So it's like the closer you start to the action, the closer you can get involved in the telling the story when you start it, the better it is, the stronger it is for the reader and stuff, because now they're engaged. Our thing is that when you open this book, I want to grab you by the collar and just drag you through this story. And you're going with me because you want to know what happened next. That would be my opinion.
So when you create a novel where you're doing a lot of world building, generally how long does it take you to get through that process of like choosing the culture, I guess, or wherever your starting point is and researching to like completion roughly?
It depends on the book. Usually I already have an idea of the culture I want to use when I start a story. I've done some research, I've seen something that kind of piqued my interest, And it basically sparked a story in me, so I know I want to use this as my background. Sometimes, since I tell people, and I just mentioned to a young man earlier, I'm a pantser. If you've been writing long enough, they say you got your outliners and you have your pantsers. Outliners can't write a thing unless they outline everything. They put a big outline and everything like that. Pantsers like me, we just jump down and start writing. And we just start flailing around, and then somewhere along the line it becomes a story somewhere in there, and we just put it all together. And sometimes my world actually builds as I'm writing the story. Because sometimes I'll get to a point where I'm like, okay, I need to study this a little bit more, because I done put this character in a situation now, and I don't really understand the situation that they're in. So I need to go do some more research about this, and so I can figure out what my character needs to do. But there's very few situations, I say at least for me, like when I wrote Changa Safari, I knew I was basing on 15th century African culture, so I had everything there. I had the world, I just had to do research and stuff. When I wrote Menji, I was creating the world. So I found myself in a lot of situations where I had kind of written myself into a corner, and I had to back up and do some more research to find out, to learn a little bit more about that situation, so I could actually get my character through it logically to where it made some kind of sense.
How do you handle writing multiple characters, like introducing them from their point of views and such?
Again, that depends on the story. Usually when I write a story, there's one character that's the main focus. The other characters are secondary characters. And I introduce them as needed, as they need to be there. And in parts of the story, sometimes it may be a situation where that particular character needs to step up. And then my primary character needs to back down, because this is something that this character needs to do. And by that time, people know these other different characters. They know their personalities, so they can ride with that in a way. In my Changa Safari series, I have a character called the Tuareg, and the Tuareg doesn't speak. He's a silent character, but he's kind of like the Legolas of my story. And most of the time in the book, he's a secondary character. But then there's one particular situation where something happens to somebody that he really cares about. And so that next chapter is just all about him, because that was his time to step up. So it's kind of like you look at the flow of the story, and you look at which each character contributes to it. And as you build a relationship, this is one of the funniest things about writing that I didn't believe when I first started writing until I really got into it, is how characters take over the story. How you're telling a story, and all of a sudden the characters are telling the story, and the story is doing something that you never imagined, because now you really know those characters. And now they're not doing what you want them to do, you're doing what they would do because you created them that way. And Changa was one of those kind of books that kicked into the second book, that all of a sudden my characters are doing stuff that I didn't even think about, because it's like, we're real now, so we're living this life, and you just need to sit there and watch. And that's one of the best moments ever when you're writing, when that starts to happen. Because now you're wondering what's going to happen next. you know how it's going. Like, I know how it's going to end. So if they get too far along, I thought, I mean, like those old video games back in the day when you go too far, to like bounce you back into the screen. it's kind of like that, that kind of thing. But it's but again, once you know you're there, once you know your character, you introduce them. I say in situations where it is appropriate, when you know that they're needed, and when they're going to be when they're going to make a serious contribution to the story.
I have a two-part question. One is, what is your favorite environment to write in, and also you prefer like handwrite, you prefer type, like just kind of describe like how you create.
Ooh, that's a good question. I have a little study where I write. Got a little desk set up, and I go there in the morning. That's what I write. I take about an hour in the morning, and that whole hour is dedicated to creative writing. It's a little bit more in the on the weekends I write a little bit more. From time to time I have to get out and study, so I grab my laptop and go sit in the den and watch. And while my wife's watching TV, I write and get on her nerves. But that's basically my scenario. And the second part of the question was?
Like, you handwrite or you type, or what is your preferred method?
I used to write longhand, because I didn't know how to type. so I had notebooks and notebooks of longhand stuff. And plus, then I started doing it, I would write longhand, and then I would type it. But then I got this book said, learn how to type 30 words, 30 minutes in 30 days, 30 words a minute in 30 days. And that's how I taught myself how to type. Now I just do straight computer because it's just more efficient. You know.
How do you get past like your personal blocks?
That's a good question. I had to physically sit down and concentrate on that. And I had to make myself make that separation, whether I liked it or not. You know, whether the character was going to do something that me personally would not believe in or something like that. But I felt it was important enough, especially when I was telling stuff that was based on African culture, because I really wanted to reflect it the right way. And I knew that some of the stuff I was writing was going to be interpreted in a negative way by some of the people that I knew that was going to be reading it. When I wrote Meji, I originally wrote it in 2 books. I split it into 2 books. And I was doing readings with different book clubs. And there was one book club, they read the first book, they were, oh, you know, Meji's great. Now in the second book, I really started getting into African spirituality. And I'm doing this, a friend of mine threw this big book party for me. We're up in this expensive expensive hotel, and everybody's in there and stuff. And they raised their hand and they said, well, we read the first book, it was great. But that second book, it was kind of evil. And I was like, okay, I know what y'all talking about. I said, well, the second book, I really got into African spirituality. And if you come from a certain culture, a certain perspective, that's what you would think. Because what you've been taught that this means. But in order for me to, and I said, I understand because we are of the same faith. I said, but for me to tell this book authentically and to do what I wanted it to do, I had to tell it this way. You know, and so that's why I did it. And that's a personal choice. You know, there's some people who are going to say, no, I can't tell that story. There's certain things that I won't write about. I just won't do it because that's just not what I want to write about. But to me, that's a personal choice. It depends on how authentic you want to be to your world and to your storytelling. You know.
How do you focus just on like the book you're writing? Because I get various ideas for other things and for other stories and so forth. So I'm just wondering, how do you stay focused on just that book and everything in that book?
The short answer is I don't. I hate to say it. I used to have about 3 books going on at one time. There's one book that's actually the major book, and the one that I spend most of my time on, but there's always like 2 other books that are like going on every now and then. And what happens is that when I get bored with the main book, I'll go to one of the other books and write a little bit on that. And then I'll say, okay, it's time to get back to the main book. And then I'll get bored again and I'll write on the other book. I mean, I'm scatterbrained. I'm ADD when it comes to writing and stuff like that. And most writers that I know are like that. It's very hard for them to focus on one particular project. It's just, I think that's just how we're built. But somehow they all get done. You know, one day you'll say, hey, this is done. How did that happen? But, you know, that's how I do it. And I don't beat myself up about it because it's part of the creative process. You know, it's just how I operate. You know, and I think that when you come to writers, it's really important that you understand your style and how you work. And don't listen to these classes that say you should do this or should do that. You know what works best for you. You know what makes your creativity comes and makes it flow. And just learn how to work with it.
So when it comes to these cultures that you research and stuff, what does that process look like? And how do you know when you're doing culture justice? That's
another good question. I try to get as many sources as possible. I try to get, when it's come from a standpoint where in the United States, I try to get history books and cultural books written by people from that culture. Because I want to try to get something that's as close to what they would tell as possible. There are some situations, like I said, when it comes like to different religions and different aspects, you will never be able to get the details because they're part of an initiation of the culture. And in order for you to find out about it, you have to be initiated into that. In some parts of Africa, being a blacksmith is a spiritual thing. In some of the ancient cultures, the chiefs were always blacksmiths, you know. And I have a friend of mine who actually is a blacksmith from the United States, and he traveled to Mali in Africa to work with blacksmiths there. And they taught him some things, but they didn't teach him everything, because those were things that were secret to that group and to that cult. And the only way you were going to learn that was that you would have to become initiated, you know. And then once he learned it, he couldn't share it anyway, because now he was part of this group. And part of it being part of this group is that you don't share that, you know. So trying to get as much detail as I can, talking to people from that culture is how I try to determine that and make sure that I'm respecting the knowledge that I'm sharing, or if I'm sharing knowledge that I shouldn't be sharing, because that's the other aspect. Sometimes you may find out something that you shouldn't have found out, and that you're presenting it in public, and the people of that culture are not happy about that happening. And to me, it's very important that I respect people's culture, that I don't, you know, step across boundaries and stuff. So I would say, you know, look at sources. I try to get at least 3 historical sources. I try to make sure that I get the majority of my historical sources from that particular culture, and sometimes that's hard to find. When I did research on African culture, a lot of the books that I found were out of print. You know, I had to dig for them and stuff like that. But now there's a wave right now that you're seeing more books come out from the culture. There are books that are available now that I didn't have back then. I found out about the market culture. I didn't realize that when you had markets in certain parts of Africa, you had a woman called a market queen, and she basically controlled the market. And all the other market people, because in Africa there's women that basically sell at the marketplace, and all the other people went to that woman to make sure that the market ran smoothly and stuff. And as soon as I learned about that, I wrote about it in a book. I said, I gotta write this because this is so cool out there. Any more questions?
What are some, okay, it's kind of 2 questions. What are some, like, resources that you, or not even resources, but just like tools you'll recommend for people who want to get more into creative writing? And maybe what are some, like, practices or things that you should do to kind of build your writing confidence?
For tools, I have an author friend of mine. His name is Stant Latore, STANT LITORE. And Stant has a series of books about character development, world building, all kind of stuff. They all of them have the title say, build characters that your readers won't forget, or build worlds that your readers won't forget. And I've read all the books, and they are very good. I think all the books I've read about world building, he does the best job at explaining it. And he also has little exercises in his books to help you like become familiar with some of the things that he's talking about. As far as confidence in writing, that's a very interesting question, because I have friends of mine who have been writing for years, and they're still not confident in their writing. The best thing I can say about that is, you know, trust your own instincts, trust that you're telling the story that you want to tell. Because you're going to always have people that look at your stuff and say, I wouldn't have told the story that way, I would have done this. But that's not their story, it's your story. You know what you're trying to tell, you know what you want to say in your story. And always focus on that. The only advice I take on my stories is technical advice. If somebody's talking to me about, okay, you're not using the Oxford comma, or something like that. But when it comes about the context of the story itself and what it's about, I don't really listen to that, because at that point you're getting into opinions. You're getting into somebody's opinion about what they think about your story, and that's not what you want from them. And as an advice for some of y'all who are submitting to people and submitting to books, to magazines and publishers and stuff like that, it's the same thing. Editors publish what they like. They may not like your story. That doesn't mean your story is a bad story. You shouldn't go cry your eyes out and stuff like that. That just means that that particular person, for whatever particular reason, did not want to publish your story. And so I've seen too many writers stall their career by that. Don't do that. As long as you're telling the story that you want to tell the way that you want to tell it, then that's good enough. I want to take a couple more questions because I see the circus people come. Right here.
How do you not get lost in the weeds of world building and focus on actually telling the story?
Oh, that's a good question. Because I write to publish my own stuff, that's how I keep from doing that. Because I know I want this story to be done by a certain time, and I want to be able to publish it and put it out there for people to read. So at some point, I'm like, okay, as long as I know I have enough of the world to where I can actually tell my story, then that's when I start telling my story. It might be fun to talk about the winds of Lorianne and how they appear every 10 years and how it changed the migration patterns of the dominant elk and all kinds of stuff like that. But then I have to ask myself, what does that have to do with my story? Unless my character is going to catch an elk when the patterns change and stuff like that, then I don't need to be spending that much time on it. So to me, it's like, focus your world building on what you need to have in order to tell your story. And one day when you tell your story and get it out there and it's selling 1 million copies, somebody may want to buy a dictionary about your story and read all about the details of the world. But in the time being, when you're telling a story, focus on those things that are going to help you tell your stories and help you build your character.
So, when you became an author, was that the first thing that you've always wanted to do, or was there something else that you wanted to do before becoming an author?
I had a whole career before I became an author. I started writing, I'm 63 now, I started writing when I was 45 years old. And that's because at that point I decided I wanted to finally do something that I always liked doing, and that was writing. Up to that point, I had played around with stuff, never finished anything, sent a few short stories out, got no rejections and stuff like that. But at that point I said, you know what, I want to go ahead and start writing. And that's when I started writing. I spent the first, I think it was 2005, I spent 3 years doing nothing but writing. And in 2008, I started releasing books because I had written like 3 novels in that time. And I just kept going, because all this stuff was coming out. So for me, it was, I'm not one of those people that tell you a story that I've been writing since I was 5 years old and all that kind of stuff like that. I kind of played with it off and on, but when I hit that point in life, that's when I started doing it.
For a beginner writer, how much, let's say, practice writing should you have to do? How much do you want to perfect what you've already done? How much do you want to research and redo things, or when do you throw things out?
Ooh, that's tough right there. I would say, the main thing is just get it on paper first. Don't worry about whether you're telling the story a certain way. Don't worry about if you're saying everything on stage. Just get it on paper. Because the writing is in the revision. That's what everybody will tell you. You just get it on paper first, get it out of you, and then go back and look at it and say, okay, am I telling the story that I wanted to tell when I first started writing this? And that comes from basically your own analysis. I would probably encourage you to take a couple of writing classes. I actually took a Writer's Digest course when I first started. I took it in one of the magazine things. They hooked you with an author one-on-one. And I did the little exercises and stuff like that. I got an honorable mention in the contest. But then I was kind of concerned. I said, was this legit? Did they really teach me about writing? So then I took another course at one of the colleges. And I did my first assignment, which was where I got that line right there. And the instructor was blown away. And I said, okay, Milt, you don't need to take any more classes. You can tell a story. You just need to start telling stories. And the process of telling and writing itself is going to make you a better writer. As you start writing more stories, it's almost like a natural thing. You start to get the better, you start to see what flows and what doesn't. I think I wrote Veggie, I wrote the first Chonga Safari book, and it was in the second book that I really feel like I hit my stride. Because that was the first time I wrote a book and I went to revise it, and I didn't make a lot of changes. And I was like, okay, I know this is me now, this is my style, this is how I tell stories. I don't need to worry about anything else now because I got my thing down now. And this is going to be me from now on. Well, it's 4:26, and I see people eagerly anticipating some flipping and things like that. So I hope I shared some things with you guys that that were helpful. If you get a chance, you can come by my table, get my card, have my email on that. I have no problem answering questions. If you're specifically doing Afrocentric type work, I actually do have a bibliography of different books that I use for resources that I'm more than happy to share with you. And I add to it as I find new resources and stuff like that. But I guess my advice to everyone is to just keep writing. Stick to the story that you want to tell and tell it. And that's it.